French President Emmanuel Macron has sparked international outrage with a controversial statement that many see as a diplomatic blunder of historic proportions. He has unleashed a diplomatic firestorm that could have far-reaching consequences for France's relationship with Africa and its global reputation, and invited the ire of all well-meaning Africans, home and abroad. Macron's recent remarks about Africa and his country's role in helping to establish and secure the sovereignty of several African nations can only be described as extremely tone-deaf and a blatant reminder of colonial arrogance. For years, France has maintained troops in several African nations under the pretext of combating terrorism and stabilizing regions. Instead, this arrogant colonial power has done nothing but create instability, disunity, and extreme poverty by consistently robbing Africa of its rich natural resources. Decades after these countries gained independence, France has continued to impose debilitating control mechanisms like the CFA franc, its language and culture on Francophone African countries. Yet, Macron just called African leaders ungrateful for failing to thank this arrogant colonial power for decades of poverty, death, extreme instability, and utter chaos. Macron made these remarks during a foreign policy conference on Monday. Here is a clip from his speech.
One part was our commitment to fighting terrorism since 2013. We were right. I think some have forgotten to say thank you, but that's okay. It'll come in time. I'm in a good position to know that ingratitude is a disease that cannot be transmitted to humans. But I say this for all the African governments who have not had the courage, in the eyes of their public opinion, to bear it. None of them would be in a sovereign country today if the French army had not been deployed in this region.
What exactly does Macron want African leaders to thank him and France for? The over 100 years of its exploitative, oppressive, and dehumanizing colonial presence in not one or two, but 21 African countries. The French firms that abused, maimed, and murdered African children by using them for child labor in their mines. The constant interference in regional issues and politics to benefit Western powers and corporations, the instability and unending violence, the bloody military coups, the abject poverty. What exactly has Macron and his predecessors done to benefit Africa and Africans that has emboldened him to be able to make such remarks? Did France thank the Nazis after they captured Paris and forced the French government to surrender during World War II? Did the Koreans thank Japan? So, why exactly is Macron trying to rewrite history by making it seem like France has done Africa a huge favor for which the entire continent must continue to grovel and cower before the colonizers till the end of time? This is nothing but colonial arrogance and blatant disrespect of Africa and Africans. We are witnessing history, the rebirth of an entire continent, and you can help amplify the struggle. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notifications bell for more videos about African empowerment and the death of neo-colonialism and imperialism. During his speech, Macron didn't just stop at calling Africans ungrateful. He also asserted that Francophone African countries owe France for their sovereignty.
Nous avions une relation sécuritaire. Elle était de deux natures en vérité. Il y a une partie, c'était notre engagement contre le terrorisme depuis 2013. On avait raison. Je crois qu'on a oublié de nous dire merci. C'est pas grave, ça viendra avec le temps. L'ingratitude, je suis bien placé pour le savoir, c'est une maladie non transmissible à l'homme. Et je le dis pour tous les gouvernants africains qui n'ont pas eu le courage vis-à-vis de leurs opinions publiques de le porter, aucun d'entre eux ne serait aujourd'hui avec un pays souverain si l'armée française ne s'était pas déployée dans cette région. Et j'ai une pensée émue pour nos soldats qui, parfois, ont donné leur vie et pendant des années se sont battus. Nous avons bien fait. On est parti parce qu'il y a eu des coups d'État. Parce qu'on était là à la demande d'États souverains qui avaient demandé à la France de venir. À partir du moment où il y a eu des coups d'État, où les gens ont dit « notre priorité, c'est plus la lutte contre le terrorisme, c'est ceci ou cela qu'importe », la France n'y avait plus sa place, parce que nous ne sommes pas les supplétifs de putschistes. Donc on est parti.
Emmanuel Macron's remarks highlight the persistence of a colonial mindset in French foreign policy, a legacy rooted in centuries of exploitation, domination, and paternalism. France's relationship with the Sahel and the broader African continent is not one of benevolent aid or partnership, but one steeped in systemic exploitation that continues to shape geopolitics today. The expectation of gratitude from African nations for French interventions reflects an unwillingness to acknowledge this exploitative history and its ongoing repercussions. Historically, France's colonial empire spanned vast regions of Africa, from Algeria and Senegal to Mali and Niger, extracting enormous wealth in the form of natural resources, labor, and agricultural products. During the colonial period, African economies were structured to serve French interests, with infrastructure, trade networks, and governance systems designed to ensure the flow of wealth from Africa to France. This exploitation funded France's industrial growth, built its cities, and bolstered its global standing. Former French President Jacques Chirac encapsulated this reality when he stated, "Without Africa, France will slide down to the rank of a third world power." This rare admission underscores how central Africa has been to France's prosperity and influence. Even after formal decolonization in the mid-20th century, France maintained control over its former colonies through neo-colonial mechanisms, often referred to as France-Afrique. Under this system, France exercised significant influence over the political and economic affairs of its former colonies, often propping up authoritarian regimes that would protect French interests. French companies, especially in industries like mining, oil, and agriculture, have continued to extract wealth from Africa, while African countries remain economically dependent on their former colonizer. Additionally, the CFA franc, a currency used by 14 African nations and directly tied to the euro, has been criticized for stifling economic sovereignty and maintaining financial control. France's military presence in the Sahel, justified as part of its counterterrorism efforts, is another extension of this neo-colonial strategy. While operations like Barkhane claim to target extremist groups, they often exacerbate instability and provoke resentment among local populations. Critics argue that these interventions prioritize French strategic interests, such as securing uranium supplies from Niger, crucial for France's nuclear energy sector, over the genuine needs of the region. Macron's demand for gratitude from Sahel nations ignores this long and painful history. Instead of expecting thanks, France should confront its past and present actions with humility and accountability. Apologies are not merely symbolic, they are an essential step toward dismantling the colonial narratives that continue to justify interference in African affairs. France owes an apology for centuries of exploitation, for plundering Africa's resources, for erasing and suppressing its cultures, and for perpetuating systems of dependency that hinder true sovereignty and development. Moreover, Macron's rhetoric about saving African nations reveals a troubling paternalistic attitude reminiscent of the colonial era's civilizing mission. This mindset, rooted in the belief that African nations are incapable of managing their affairs without external guidance, perpetuates inequality and denies the agency of African leaders and populations. It ignores the reality that many of Africa's challenges, economic instability, political turmoil, and security threats, are deeply tied to the legacies of colonialism and neo-colonialism. True partnership with Africa requires more than rhetoric or military interventions. It demands that France acknowledge its historical and ongoing role in creating the very crises it claims to address. It involves supporting African-led initiatives, respecting sovereignty, and addressing systemic inequalities in trade, finance, and international relations. Until France confronts its colonial legacy with honesty and implements meaningful changes to its policies, its claims of partnership will remain hollow, and resentment across the African continent will continue to grow. History is being made, and you can be a part of it. Show your support for African empowerment by liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and helping us spread these incredible stories across the globe. Fortunately, some African leaders have responded to Macron's remarks, showing the French president how tone-deaf his remarks were. Chad's President Mahamat Idriss Déby Itno has informed Macron that he is living in the wrong era, adding that he is outraged by Macron's remarks, which border on contempt for Africa and Africans. Macron is indeed living in the wrong era, the era of Africans being willing and obedient puppets in the games of France and other colonial powers. Today, the continent is taking a stance against exploitation, oppression, abuse, subjugation, and the unbelievable arrogance of people like Macron. Chad's Foreign Affairs Minister, Abderrahmane Koulamala, also had a word or two for Macron. Here is a clip of his statement being read out on state television.
The government of the Republic of Chad expresses its deep concern at the remarks made recently by the President of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron, which reflect a contemptuous attitude towards Africa and Africans. Instead of attacking Africa, President Macron should concentrate his efforts on solving the problems that preoccupy the French people. Chad wishes to reiterate that it has no problem with France as a nation, nor with the French people, with whom it shares a history marked by human and cultural relations. However, French leaders must learn to respect the African people and recognize the value of their sacrifices.
Senegal's Prime Minister, Ousmane Sonko, had an even stronger rebuke for the French president. In a social media post, Sonko not only reminded Macron of his country's role in destabilizing African countries like Libya, but also asserted that France does not have the capacity to ensure Africa's security and sovereignty. Here is a translated version of the post. President Emmanuel Macron said today that no African country would be sovereign today if France had not deployed. Let us note that France has neither the capacity nor the legitimacy to ensure Africa's security and sovereignty. On the contrary, it has often contributed to destabilizing certain African countries, such as Libya, with disastrous consequences noted for the stability and security of the Sahel. This is finally the place to remind President Macron that if African soldiers, sometimes forcibly mobilized, mistreated, and ultimately betrayed, had not deployed during the Second World War to defend France, it would perhaps still be German today. Macron needed a quick history lesson, which he rightly got from Sonko. The French president has quickly forgotten the bravery and sacrifice of African soldiers who fought for France during World War II. Known as tirailleurs sénégalais, these soldiers were part of the French colonial army and played a critical role in France's military campaigns during both world wars. Recruited from Senegal and other territories in French West Africa, they endured racism, exploitation, and ultimately, betrayal by the country they served. During World War II, thousands of West African soldiers, including those from Senegal, were conscripted or volunteered to fight for France. They served in a variety of roles, including infantry, artillery, and logistics, and were instrumental in several key campaigns. These soldiers fought bravely in North Africa, Europe, and even during the liberation of France from Nazi occupation. Despite their contributions, the tirailleurs sénégalais faced systemic discrimination. They were often paid less than their white counterparts, given inferior equipment, and subjected to poor living conditions. Racism permeated their experience, with colonial authorities and military leaders frequently regarding African soldiers as expendable. The Tirailleurs Massacre of 1944. One of the most tragic and infamous episodes in the history of the tirailleurs sénégalais occurred after the war when many soldiers returned to Africa expecting recognition and fair compensation for their service. Instead, they faced neglect and betrayal. On November 30th, 1944, hundreds of Senegalese veterans gathered at a military camp in Thiaroye, near Dakar, to demand the payment of back wages and pensions they were owed by the French government. These soldiers had endured years of hardship, and their demands for fair treatment were entirely justified. However, the French authorities responded with brutality. French troops opened fire on the unarmed veterans, killing between 35 and over 400 men, depending on differing accounts. Survivors were arrested and subjected to harsh punishments in an attempt to suppress dissent and maintain colonial authority. France only recently admitted to this massacre. On the eve of the 80th anniversary of the killings in November, Macron sent a letter to Senegalese President Bassirou Diomaye Faye, officially recognizing the event as a cold-blooded massacre for the first time in history. France must recognize that on that day, the confrontation between soldiers and riflemen who demanded their full legitimate wages be paid triggered a chain of events that resulted in a massacre, Macron wrote in his letter, according to the AP news agency. In 2014, then President François Hollande called the event a bloody repression. Yet, France expects gratefulness from Africans for persistently looting their countries until there's absolutely nothing else to give. It's absolutely beyond belief. Macron's remarks stand as a glaring reminder of an unhealed wound. a wound inflicted by centuries of colonial domination and exploitation. France owes its global standing to Africa's sacrifices, yet the narrative is twisted to demand gratitude where an apology is due. The blood of Senegalese soldiers, the wealth stripped from the Sahel, and the cultures suppressed cry out for recognition, not condescension. It's time to shatter the illusion of benevolent intervention and confront the truth. The era of paternalistic arrogance must end. If France truly seeks to redefine its relationship with Africa, it must start with an unflinching acknowledgement of its past, a past that enriched one nation at the expense of countless others. Only then can the weight of history be lifted and the promise of a just and equal partnership be fulfilled. Thank you for watching this important discussion on the lingering impact of colonial history. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like it to help spread the message. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and join the conversation. Most importantly, don't miss out on future content that dives deep into stories like these. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we upload new videos. Your support means everything. Together, we can amplify voices and spark meaningful change. Thank you.